Today we are going to the early 19th century, so sit back as we go to Germany. Gesche Marguerite Timm was born on March 6, 1785, in the northern German city of Bremen. Her father worked as a tailor and her mother worked as a seamstress. Together they managed to provide for their family, and although they lived in one of the poorer neighbourhoods of the city, Gesche had a comfortable upbringing. She was a twin, and she always felt that her parents favoured her brother. In the late 18th century, Bremen was a prosperous city, and being situated on the river Weser, made it a centre for commerce and industry. So Gesche's father had many wealthy clients to look after. He was able to send his daughter to singing and dancing lessons, and she dreamed of becoming an actress. Theatre productions were always very well attended events at the time, and many travelling theatre companies would arrive in the city, bringing with them their latest production and their flamboyant costumes. They always attracted a large audience, and many young people considered that joining the theatre would be an exciting way of life. Gesche's father, however, had a very different idea of what his daughter should do. She grew up to be a very beautiful young lady, but instead of trying to seek a marriage with a more affluent and prominent family, he agreed that she should marry at the first opportunity. So when she was 21 years old, he agreed to the proposal from a young man named Johann Mittelberg. Some of the residents of Bremen considered this to be a strange match, as although Johann's parents lived in a more affluent part of the city, he wasn't a person from a family of a high social standing, and he worked making and repairing horse saddles. Many had thought that the beautiful young Gesche would have married a young man from one of the city's high-ranking families, as many of them had sought her affections. At first the marriage was good, and the couple had 3 children, but as time went by, things started to change. Johann's father died, and he inherited an amount of money which Gesche considered would be very helpful for the family. But after his father's death, Johann started to spend much of his time in the city taverns. It did not take long for him to spend everything he had inherited, and in 1813 he had the uncomfortable task of telling his wife that they were now destitute. A few months later, Johann Mittelberg was taken ill with terrible stomach pains, and shortly afterwards he died. Gesche was now a widow and entered a long period of mourning. When she was seen in the street, she would still acknowledge people in her friendly and charming manner, and the people of the city still held her in high regard. About 18 months after the death of her husband, Gesche was courted by a very respectable gentleman named Michael Christoph Gottfried. He was a wine merchant and lived a comfortable life. Marrying a man such as him would certainly have improved her circumstances, but she was a mother of 3 young children and the daughter of aging parents. Her priorities lied elsewhere. Then on May the 1st, 1815, tragedy struck again when Gesche's mother died. She had suffered horribly with stomach pains, and whilst being lovingly nursed by her daughter, her condition worsened until she eventually died. Within 3 weeks, Gesche's daughters, Johanna and Adelheid, suffered with stomach pains, and whilst being nursed by their mother, they died. 5 weeks later, on June the 28th, Gesche's father also died. Then on September the 22nd, her son Henrik was also taken ill and died. Death had followed Gesche and dealt her the cruelest blow. Her entire family, except her brother, had now been taken from her, and the local people rallied round her to offer their heartfelt sympathies. In the early 19th century, diseases such as cholera and typhoid were known to destroy families and communities, and in 1816, a cholera epidemic spread across Europe. The people of Bremen believed Gesche to have been a devoted daughter, wife, and mother, and praised her for her tireless devotion to her family during their horrible illnesses. They called her the Angel of Bremen. The cholera epidemic had caused the deaths of many people, so when her brother, who was a soldier in the army, unexpectedly returned to claim his parents' small inheritance, it was not considered strange that he suddenly became ill. He was nursed by his loving and devoted sister, but eventually he died on the 1st of June, 1816. Gesche was now 31 years old and a widow, but still a very attractive lady. So when Angel Gottfried eventually asked her for a hand in marriage, she accepted and became Gesche Gottfried. But she soon realised that although her husband gave the impression he was wealthy, he in fact had many debts. They were not married for very long, as after a brief illness, he died on the 5th of July, 1817. Gesche had now lost her 2 husbands, her 3 children, her parents, and her brother in the space of 4 years. She lived in the house left to her by her late husband, and despite the debts she inherited, she continued her charitable work, every day visiting the poor, sick, and the homeless, and was considered a truly kind and sympathetic lady. Her creditors acknowledged her efforts and could not appear uncharitable to such a popular member of the community, so let her continue to owe them money. In 1823, Gesche's neighbour, named Paul Thomas Zimmermann, proposed to her. She was now 38 years old, but before they had a chance to marry, he became ill and died on the 1st of June, just a few months after they had become engaged. Despite not actually marrying, Gesche inherited her deceased fiancé's house and started to live there. She continued to engage in her charity and community work, but over the next few years, more of her acquaintances succumbed to horrible deaths. These were all put down to illnesses such as cholera, typhoid, and diphtheria. On the 21st of March, 1825, her music teacher, named Anna Lucia Meyerholtz, died. Then on the 5th of December, in the same year, her friend and neighbour, Johann Moses, who had been ill for nearly a year, also perished. Gesche had been widowed twice and did not engage in paid employment, which meant her financial problems were increasing, so she decided to sell her house. She sold it to a very nice couple named Johann and Wilhelmina Rumpf. This worked out well for Gesche, as knowing her reputation for being such a helpful and caring person, they asked her to stay living there to work as their housekeeper. However, as it always seemed to do, tragedy soon followed her, and Wilhelmina was taken ill in December 1826. Gesche stayed by her bedside, doing her best to calm her during her final hours. Before she died, she told her husband that she was comforted in the knowledge that there was a kind-hearted housekeeper in the house, and that while he worked, Gesche should manage the household and be in charge of the gardener and the nurse who looked after the children. On December the 22nd, Wilhelmina Rumpf died. Gesche, as helpful and kind as ever, did indeed take on the responsibility of caring for the grieving widow. She continued to prepare the meals for the family and took control of the staff. But ill fortune still clung to the Angel of Bremen, and soon the maid and the nurse became extremely ill. They both managed to recover, but the nurse told Johann that she would no longer work there, as illness and death seemed to follow the housekeeper. Johann, however, still trusted Gesche. He remembered how selflessly she had cared for his wife and how well she was regarded by the people of Bremen. Then, quite suddenly, the healthy and fit gentleman became ill himself. He had not really been ill before, but this time he was suffering with severe pains in his stomach. The words of the nurse started to echo in his mind, that illness and death seemed to follow the housekeeper. He started to think about why so many people became ill when she was in their presence. The more he thought about it, the more suspicious he became. and he decided to observe her more closely. A few days later, he noticed small white granules mixed in with the food she had served him. He carefully took samples of it to a chemist named Dr. Luce. In 1827, toxology was in its infancy, but Dr. Luce concluded that the small, innocent-looking granules were in fact arsenic, so the two gentlemen immediately alerted the authorities. However, Gesche was one step ahead of them, and realizing that something was amiss, she left Bremen and travelled 135 kilometres to the city of Hanover. Death followed her there, as in May 1827, her friend Betta Schmidt and her daughter Elise were taken ill. Elise eventually died on the 13th of May, followed by her mother 2 days later. The same fate met one of her creditors, named Frederick Klein, on the 24th of July, 1827. The authorities eventually caught up with her on March the 6th, 1828, which was her 43rd birthday, and Gesche Gottfried was arrested. News of her arrest soon spread over the city, and its inhabitants were dismayed that a lady so beloved and respected had been accused of such wicked acts. They thought that the authorities were probably mistaken, and this was just an accusation of a still grieving widow. But some whispered that all the deaths that had followed her had strange similarities between them. The person assigned to her case was Senator Franz Frederick Drost. He was intrigued to find out how her mind worked and why she had over the years poisoned so many people. At first she denied any knowledge of the crimes, but as time passed, she admitted that she had poisoned 15 people, all who had died due to her actions, and she confessed to poisoning many more who had survived. Her method was simple. She would put poisoned butter used to kill rodents on bread and cakes. It was a mixture of arsenic and lard, but as this ran out, she had latterly used arsenic powder. The authorities seemed fascinated with her and kept her incarcerated for 3 years before her case went to court. During her period of incarceration, she was tortured by visions of the deceased people that she had poisoned, and piece by piece, she told the authorities the story of her crimes. When the trial eventually started, her defense lawyer pleaded insanity, pointing to the fact that the poisonings were not for financial gain. But the prosecution stated that she had never previously been considered insane and had always been known as a respected and well-liked woman, a good citizen of Bremen. The prosecution added that she was a woman completely steeped in self-deception. When the court case ended, Gesche was found guilty and sentenced to death. Her execution took place on the 21st of April, 1831, and she was very disappointed to be told of the dress she would have to wear to be executed in, but she reluctantly put it on before being led out in front of thousands of spectators at the Bremen Cathedral Square. She received a last glass of wine, which she took a quick sip of, then handed back to the judges, before Gesche Gottfried was beheaded. She was the last person to be publicly executed in the city of Bremen. Hello everyone, and thank you so much for listening. As per usual, please leave any comments or feedback you may have, and I will see you in the next brief case